topic. It's an important topic, and the official position of Ratio Christi is the Bible is inerrant, but this topic is not about that. It's also not about canonicity, like why certain books are in the Bible and not others. It's not about that. It's about the reliability of the New Testament based on the accepted principles of historical and textual analysis. Okay, we're basically looking at the Bible as a set of historical documents, just as we would any other ancient document from Tacitus or Suetonius or other Greek and Roman historians. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. We're going to look at the Bible as a set of historical documents and judge it on its reliability based on those standards. Okay. And for the purposes of tonight, we are only going to be talking about the New Testament. Why? Well, the New Testament establishes that Jesus is God, and if Jesus says that the Old Testament is the Word of God, then we kind of get the Old Testament along with the New Testament if we establish that the New Testament is reliable. I mean, there are independent ways to verify the Old Testament as well, but tonight we're just going to be focusing on the New Testament. And if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to raise your hand. All right, so here are some objections that you may hear. So let's hear some different voices. Somebody take the first one. Just read it out. Kind of in an angry voice, if possible.
The New Testament can't be reliable because it's been changed throughout the centuries.
Good. Someone else.
The Bible is just a religious book. You can't trust its views of historical events.
Good. Next.
All of the New Testament writers were biased, therefore you can't trust anything they wrote down.
Nothing. You can't trust anything. Right. One more.
You can't trust the New Testament writers. They were just making up stories so people would follow them.
Right. Yes. So these are some of the common objections you might hear. Not necessarily from scholars and academics, but kind of at the street level where we all reside and live. Okay? So, let's just look at the first one. I mean, how might you respond to that? And not even knowing anything about the subject matter. For some of the old-timers that have been here for a while, think back to Greg Kokel and tactics. Like, not even knowing about how to answer specifically these objections. What might you say to even just the first one? Some of the people that have been with us for a while.
I would say that depends on what you mean by change, because it's been translated, but we haven't actually changed what it said. We just put it in a different language.
Okay, right. What do you mean by changed? Going back to the very first question from Greg Kokel's Tactics, and for those that haven't been with us for a while, that's okay. But basically, you're going to make someone define their terms. Okay, what do you mean by changed? And you can do that for some of these other ones. What do you mean by biased? Right? And then if they give you an answer, we'll say, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Now, this is any document, really, any historical ancient document. We're going to look at two main questions. Do we have an accurate copy of the original document? And do the documents tell the truth? Okay? And so a question then. So why are we concerned about whether we have a copy of the original documents? Why don't we just go to the original documents? What's this about? Like, why do we have to worry about the copy of the original documents? Anybody know? Yeah.
Maybe because we can't understand them because they're in a different language, or maybe because we can't find them.
Possibly. Anyone else?
They got destroyed.
Yes. So I hope this is not a faith breaker for you, but I'm going to bear some bad news for those who have possibly never heard this before. We do not have the original documents of the New Testament. Now, don't panic. Because this is true for every other ancient work of literature or history. Okay? The original documents for all these ancient sources, they're gone. Okay? Plato, Caesar, Herodotus, Thucydides, Tacitus, Suetonius, etc. All the original documents are gone. Okay? They're all gone. So it's not just the New Testament. So if someone throws that objection at you, it's true. But it's also true for every other ancient work of literature or history. Okay? Why? Why are they gone? Why are they missing? Okay, well, they could be simply lost. They could be worn out because they were written on perishable material, worn out through copying. They could be damaged by rodents, insects, etc., rot, decay, or they could be destroyed by persecutions. Okay, one of the Roman emperors, Diocletian, in the 300s, there was an actual persecution against Christians, and one of his edicts was to find documents and destroy them, Christian documents and destroy them. So there's those kinds of things that happen that can make the original documents simply disappear. Okay, so don't panic. So if we don't have the originals, how can we ever know what the originals said? Right? Copies, yes. So the way that we do this, we reconstruct what the original said by comparing the manuscripts that we do have, that do survive. Okay, and a manuscript is simply a hand-copied text. And with regards to the New Testament, we have fragments, we have pages, we have books, and we have entire compilations. Okay, so it kind of runs the gamut, but any of those is considered a manuscript. And again, this applies to all the ancient works from literature history. And this reconstructing using manuscripts is called textual criticism. And that's how it's done. So what we're going to talk tonight about is the textual criticism and trying to understand if the New Testament is reliable. Okay, so let's go back to our two questions here. Do we have an accurate copy, and do the original documents tell the truth? Now, with regards to whether something is accurate, what we are talking about is how do we know that in the 21st century, what we have written in our Bibles is what was actually written in the first century? Okay, is it accurate? We're not talking about whether it's true yet. We're just saying what we have now, is it what was written back then? Okay, so we look at a few questions here. How many manuscripts do we have? How early are they? And how important are textual variants? We'll talk about what textual variants means here in just a little bit. So let's look at the first question. How many manuscripts do we have? So I'm going to show you a chart that compares New Testament manuscripts with other works from antiquity. Okay. So here are some numbers, just to give you some comparison. So starting up there with Tacitus, he was a Roman historian. There are 31 surviving manuscripts. Thucydides, 95. Herodotus, 109. You can just go down the list, okay? One of the best attested works from antiquity is actually Homer's Iliad, currently at 1757. They're finding manuscripts all the time. I mean, they can find them. Because if you had looked 10 years ago for the New Testament, it would not be 5,800, it would be something less. And in 10 years from now, it'll be more than 5,800. So, but you can see, just by comparing the sheer number of manuscripts, the New Testament far outweighs any other manuscript evidence from the ancient world. That's impressive. It doesn't compare, really. I'm sorry, let's go back. These are the Greek manuscripts here, the original language. There are also other manuscripts of the New Testament written in other languages, such as Syriac, Slavic, Gothic, Ethiopic, Coptic, Armenian. When you combine all those manuscripts together, there are over 25,000 New Testament manuscripts. So just by sheer numbers. Now, why would it be good to have a lot of manuscripts? What do you think?
More to compare to.
More to compare to, right. That's basically the simple answer. The more we have, the better idea we can have. Remember, we're trying to get back to possibly what the originals said. So the more we have to compare, the more confidence we can have that that's the case. In addition to just the number of manuscripts that we have, we also have to date more than 1 million quotations of the New Testament by the church fathers, by the early church fathers. So even if the New Testament manuscripts were all to go away, it can pretty much, actually, I think it's the next slide. Yeah. This is a book, a quote from a book by Bart Ehrman, who's no friend to Christianity, and Bruce Metzger, who is a friend to Christianity. But before Bart was an enemy, he and Dr. Metzger wrote a book called The Text of the New Testament where they kind of go through all of this textual criticism stuff. But here's a quote from that book. They say, "Indeed, so extensive are the citations that if all other sources of our knowledge of the New Testament were destroyed, they would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament." So again, there's a lot of evidence out there, manuscript evidence and quotation evidence as well. Okay, so we've talked about how many. Next thing, how early are the manuscripts? How close to the original documents are the first surviving manuscripts? That's what we're going to look at. So again, another chart here. These are the same folks we just looked at a minute ago. So again, what we're saying is from the time that Tacitus wrote his original histories to the first surviving manuscript is a gap of 800 years. Okay? Thucydides does a lot better, but some of these others, even Plato, from his original writings to the first surviving manuscripts, 1,300 years is the gap. So go down to the New Testament, 35 years. That's, when you compare it to other ancient documents, that's quite impressive. Okay, 35 years is basically the gap. Okay, and just to kind of, it took me a while to sort of understand this when I started learning all this stuff, so I put another example up here. So here's a hypothetical example. So the Declaration of Independence was written in, yes, right. So imagine, suppose that that document was lost, destroyed, gone, wiped off the face of the earth, not sitting in Washington, D.C. in the National Archives building, okay? If it was gone, destroyed, and then suppose further that the first copy that we had was from 1876, well, that would be a 100-year gap, okay, from the time we know it was written to the first surviving manuscript. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, go back. Why is it better to have documents that are closer to the original? Why is it better to have earlier documents?
Corroborating evidence just over time, I guess.
Okay, what else?
The closer the manuscript is, like, in years to the original document, that's less time for it to be changed in paper book. So if you look at, like, the 1,300 years between Plato's original and the first surviving manuscript, that's 1,300 years that people could tamper with it and change Plato's original ideas. So 35 years is much, much shorter for ideas to then change.
Right.
It's less likely.
Yeah, so it basically comes down to it's less time for it to have become corrupted by in some way, the closer you get to the source, to the original. Okay, so first two questions, how many, how early? Now we're going to spend a good amount of time on this because this is actually, you might hear a big part of objections to the New Testament are textual variants, okay? And again, we're going to go over a couple of things that I hope don't bust your faith, but I'll give you the antidote, and you'll be okay. You won't panic. All right. So, a textual variant is defined as any place among existing New Testament manuscripts where there is not uniformity of wording. Where there is not uniformity of wording, no matter how small or insignificant. Okay? We're talking about spelling. One letter difference, that's a textual variant, okay? Word order, substitution, like synonyms, omissions or additions. We're going to do some examples of this so you kind of get a sense, okay? Now, before I show you the next slide, again, don't panic. Your heart rate might go up. It sounds absurd. Technically, it's true, but don't panic. We're going to talk about it. So the surviving Greek manuscripts of the New Testament have around 400,000 textual variants. And yet, the New Testament itself only has about 138,000 words. How can that be? Sounds crazy, right? How can you have more variants than there are words in the New Testament? We're going to talk about how. Yes, sir.
Another word that's used for variant, especially at the popular level, is just mistake or error. So sometimes you'll hear people say that there's 400,000 mistakes, errors in the Bible. Technically that's true, But unless that's explained, it can really freak Christians out. That's why it's important to understand this stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm keeping it more on like, this is the textual criticism vocabulary, but you're right. If you just hear errors, and again, you hear that, and it could just like, you're just going to go off in a corner and weep, okay?
Technically, it's true.
Right, but we're going to talk about how it's actually not that. You will be able to handle this objection and understand why, okay? I need 2 volunteers. Come on up. You 2, come on up. All right. So here's what I want you to do. I want one of you to count. Like I said, this is a hypothetical example, okay, from a line of Scripture. Now, I want one of you to count the number of these little hashtag things, which would be a variant, and I want one of you to count the number of words in just one of the sentences, like the one sentence. But I want the other one to count all of the textual variants, okay?
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Alright.
So who wants to do what?
I'll count the hashtags, I guess.
Okay, so I'm counting all the words.
The words in one sentence.
The words and
Right, I mean, there's different sentences up here, but if you just had like the one sentence, how many words would be in just the one sentence?
Okay.
We've got different examples of that sentence, but just in the one sentence, how many words would there be?
Right.
Okay, so Jay, you count the variants?
Oh, out loud?
No, just go, if you have to use your fingers, go ahead. And,
Oh, okay. I do need to use my
this is interactive, yeah.
Times if you run out of fingers.
2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15.
So you're just counting one of the sentences, right?
Yeah.
Like if you were just to go across.
I counted 2.
Wait, words?
No, in the 2 sentences in total.
Just one.
Just one sentence. So like,
All right.
so like this would be 1,
Okay.
2, 3,
Oh.
4, like that.
Okay. 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Bottom sentence.
Yes, correct. So, y'all can sit down now. Let's give them a hand. So the point is, there's 14 words here, but there's 15 variants. So I just showed you how you can have more variants than there are words in a sentence. Now, how is that possible, just based on this example?
The variants are in multiple sentences, or like multiple different transcripts.
Right, imagine these are 1, 2, 3, 4, imagine these are 6 different manuscripts, okay? So we count the variants across all of the manuscripts, but we're only looking at one sentence as a thought, okay? Does that make sense? So 15 variants among these manuscripts, only 14 words, okay? So I'm just trying to give you a sense of when you see that 400,000, but only 138,000 words, that's how it can happen. Now this is a grossly there are not this many variants just I just did this for illustrative purposes, okay? There would not be this many spelling errors, things like that, just among, or omissions. But again, I just wanted to use that as an example. So, again, don't panic. Hopefully you understand, how you can have these more variants than there are words in a sentence, okay? The point is, when we compare all of these sentences together, can we figure out probably what the original said? Yeah, when we compare amongst them, right? There would not be any doubt that this is most likely the actual sentence of those hypothetical manuscripts. Okay, we can compare them all together. Yeah, there's something missing here, but it's actually not missing there. Here's something missing, but it's not missing. So, right, we can. That's the idea of textual criticism. That's what we're talking about. Okay, Daniel Wallace, who is a New Testament scholar, he says no classical Greek or Latin text has nearly as many variants because they don't have nearly as many manuscripts. Right? We already saw that. There's 5,800 plus New Testament manuscripts. So with virtually every new manuscript discovery, and they're still making them, new variants are found. If there was only one copy of the New Testament in existence, how many variants would we have? 0. Why? Because that's the only one. There's nothing else to compare it to. If we only had one copy, there'd be no variants. All right. Got a sense of the variants now, or errors, as Adam said? Okay, we're going to spend a little more time on this because what are these variants? Okay. Well, 75% of them are simple spelling errors. That's 300,000 of the 400,000 are spelling errors. Okay. So an example, John's Greek name is actually spelled two different ways. One of them has two N's, and one of them has one N. That's a textual variant. Is there any doubt who they're talking about, though? No. These do not affect the meaning of the text. They're just spelling errors. 15% of these textual variants, they're variations in either Greek synonyms or word order. Okay, a couple of examples here. Jesus Christ versus Christ Jesus. That's a variant. But does that change the meaning of? No, it doesn't, right? It doesn't change the meaning. Lord versus Jesus, or the Lord versus our Lord. Those are all variants because it's not uniformity of word order. These do not affect the meaning of the text. So just between these two, with spelling differences or synonyms, word order, that's 90% of the textual variants that you'll find in the New Testament manuscripts. Just over 9% or so of the variants, they're what's called meaningful, but they're not viable. Is that a question? No. Oh, okay. So they do affect the meaning somewhat, but they're not viable. And what viable means is they really cannot make a good case for going back to the original text. Okay, so here's an example. A single 11th century manuscript says, well, let's read the first one. Okay, so Luke 6:22. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, and revile you, and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Okay, so a single 11th century manuscript says, blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, and revile you, and spurn your name as evil. What's missing in the second part? It doesn't have this, right? So it kind of changes the meaning of the text, sort of. But again, it's an 11th century manuscript. It's 1,000 years after the time of Jesus. So you can't there's no way it can be part of the original text. It's obvious that it's not, right? So about 9% are things like that. They're typically late additions, or they arise late in the manuscript tradition. So that leaves less than 1% that are the ones that are interesting, so to speak. These are both meaningful and viable. So they do change the meaning somewhat, and they can make a case for possibly being in the original text. They're just not sure, okay? So what kinds of variants are these? If they change the meaning and they might be in the original text, okay? Well, first of all, we're not talking about things that say Jesus was a thief. Jesus told lies. Jesus was not the Son of God. We're not talking, this is not part of this 1% that we're talking about. Here is an example of what we're talking about. 1 Thessalonians 2:7. But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own child. Another manuscript says, but we were infants among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. Wow. Right? So, yes, it does sort of change the meaning, right? Gentle, infants, they're different words, enough so that it kind of changes the meaning. But it would only affect our understanding of that one particular passage. Okay? It's not, it's not something that's just totally opposite of any doctrine that we've been taught. Yes?
I would say that only changes the meaning as far as English is concerned. If you look back towards the original text, since many Greek and Aramaic words can be translated into multiple words of English, like a single word can have multiple English meanings depending on how it's used in context. I doubt that even changes the original text, does it?
Well, going back to the Greek, a lot of these things like that, it actually is only a single letter in Greek that changes the meaning. So either somebody was lazy or, slipped their quill or whatever.
So it might not even be that it may even be that we're misinterpreting the word itself, not really that the word is different. It's just that somebody's handwriting got a little sloppy at one point, so we're ascribing a different, like for example, when I write the number 4, I write it in such that it can look like a 9 if you're kind of weird. I still don't understand how people mistake my 4s for 9s, but I write it so where the top part is all connected. I don't write it like a number, like straight up and then like down and crossing through. So some people mistake it for 9s. I would ascribe that to a similar sort of situation, right?
Yeah, and again, these are viable. So there's enough, manuscripts that it could be one or it could be the other. So the mistake or the variant isn't enough. We just don't know if it was in the original. But again, it's not something that is totally different. We're not talking about a variant that says Jesus is not the Son of God, or these other ones. Here's another example. Okay, Romans 5:1. Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Another manuscript says, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, let us have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. That's part of the 1%. This is what we're talking about, okay? And again, I'm not sure, I'm not a Greek scholar, but in some of my reading, I know that some of these are only a single letter difference even in Greek. So that's what it counts. And when we translate it, right, this is what we get. So here's the thing too. And these disputed variants, they're actually not hidden. If this is the first time that you're hearing this, that's great because you're in a good setting to hear it. But they're not hidden from Christians. If you've ever really looked at a study Bible or anything like Bible Gateway, it's not secret information, the things that we're just talking about. So here's the two examples that we just looked at. 1 Thessalonians 2:7. Here's the word gentle. But look, there's a little footnote, and if you go down, it tells you some manuscripts, infants. That's what we just talked about. Okay, so it's not hidden. I mean, you might have to read the fine print, but this stuff is out there. Okay, and the other one that we just looked at, Romans 5:1. Therefore, since we've been justified by faith, we have peace. But there's the footnote right there. Some manuscripts let us. So it's right there in plain sight. Any questions on that? Okay. So what about Mark 16:9 through 20 and John 7:53 through 8:11? Anyone know what those passages are?
If you go to the Bible, it'll say like these were added later or these were missing from the original copy of the Bible.
Yeah, so this is what's typically known as the long ending of Mark. And we're going to look at it in just a second. And then the John passage, anyone know what passage that is?
Is that the I am stuff? No.
The woman caught in adultery, yes. Devin knows. So the passage in John with the woman caught in adultery, that's the passage, okay? So here's what about them. They're not found in the earliest manuscripts. Okay, both passages are usually bracketed with a note stating they are not found in the earliest manuscripts. And even if we were to do away with these passages altogether, no essential Christian doctrines are affected. So again, I know it's kind of small, but I just want you to see. So here's the Mark passage, 16:9 through 20. Right up here is the bracket. It tells you some of the earliest manuscripts do not include this. And then even when the passage starts, here's brackets, and it goes all the way to the end, and there's brackets, okay? So again, it's not hidden information. You may have never noticed it before, but it's not hidden information. And then the footnotes explain some of this too. So it's there. And you could look at the John passage, it would be the same type of thing. Okay, so let's go back to Bart Ehrman. We talk about him frequently. Top-notch New Testament scholar, agnostic, somewhat hostile to Christianity, I suppose. Not really a friend of Christianity, but he knows his stuff. He's a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Here's a quote from his book, Misquoting Jesus. He says, "What good is it to say that the autographs, i.e. the originals," we call them manuscripts, handwritten copies, but the autographs are technically the originals. But what good is it to say that they were inspired? We don't have the originals. We have only error-ridden copies. There are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. So, it's a provocative statement. Technically, it's true. It's worded in a clever way. But it's terribly misleading, right? Especially based on what we know, even on that last sentence, right? That's not so scary now that we know about variations and more words. There's more variations than there are words. We know what that means now. But check this out. So that's kind of like bad Bart, but here's good Bart. Here's another quote from Bart Ehrman. Same book. This is on page 90. This is on page 207. So Bart Ehrman, same book, just later in the book, he says, to be sure, of all the hundreds of thousands of textual changes found among our manuscripts, most of them are completely insignificant, immaterial, or of no real importance for anything other than showing that scribes could not spell or keep focused any better than the rest of us. Okay? And again, this is a book that Bart Ehrman wrote all on his own. When he wrote the book with Bruce Metzger, the New Testament scholar, probably one of the most preeminent New Testament scholars that's ever lived, he was more in line, I guess, of being friendly to Christianity. But when he wrote his own book, more at the popular level, this is where a lot of the objections that you hear from Bart Ehrman come from, is this book and some of the others that he's written. But I just wanted to show you like the two aspects of Bart Ehrman. Okay? Same book. All right, so let's wrap up the textual variants here. We already said there's about 5,800 plus or so New Testament manuscripts, the average of which is about 350 pages. That's approximately 2 million pages of handwritten text, if you put them all together. So the 1%, the 1,500 to 2,000 meaningful and viable variants over the 2 million pages of handwritten text spanning approximately 1,500 years, which is up to the time of the printing press, is an amazingly small percentage, only about 0.1% of the New Testament. 0.1. Okay? And these meaningful and viable variants, 0% affect any Christian doctrine, 0% affect any Christian theology, only our understanding of certain passages. And the disputed variants, like I said, they're not hidden, they're not secret. Most study Bibles will have them in there. A quote from John Warwick Montgomery. He says, to be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no documents of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. Okay? So any questions on the whole textual variant aspect? So 400,000 textual variants doesn't sound so intimidating now, right? With 138,000 words, we know how to answer that, hopefully. I'm only talking about 1% that's even really kind of meaningful, and they don't contradict any part of Christian theology or doctrine. Okay, so that was all to answer the big question one. Yes. So do we have an accurate copy? We can say yes. Why? Because even though we no longer have the original New Testament documents, we can reconstruct them by comparing, cross-checking the thousands of manuscripts that we do have. We have more manuscripts, we have earlier manuscripts than any other work of ancient antiquity. I guess that's redundant. Antiquity. All right. Let's move on to the second question. Do the original documents tell the truth? Okay, it doesn't do us any good if we have an accurate copy of a fairy tale. Are they true? That's what we want to know now. And there's kind of 5 areas that we can look at to answer this question. They all start with the letter E. This comes, I know Frank Turek, this is one of the methods that he uses, and it's a good one to kind of memorize with them all starting with the letter E. Early testimony, eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating, and extra biblical. We're going to talk about each of these individually. So let's talk about early testimony first. Okay, here is a timeline of the New Testament. Now, there's disagreement on when New Testament documents were written, but using the biblical texts, along with historical events and archaeological evidence, this timeline can be plausibly constructed. Okay? Does anything stand out at you about that? Have you ever seen the actual dates kind of by numbers or by the books?
Well, Jesus died in 33, right?
Right.
So that's not very long at all.
Yeah, I think a lot of people growing up, you think that because the way they're laid out in the Bible, that Mark was the first thing written. But they're actually, the letters of Paul and even James were before the Gospels, some of them. Okay? And one other thing that we're going to talk about in just a minute is, with the exception of John in his letters and his gospel and Revelation, and there's even disagreement among some of that, but the way it's laid out here, everything else is written before 70 AD. Now, does anyone know anything significant that happened in 70 AD, if you know your Jewish history? Yes, ma'am?
That was the destruction of the temple, wasn't it?
Right. Right, so that's one of the things we're going to look at to talk about, are these documents early? And again, the closer to the the closer to the events, the better. So as you said, the destruction of the temple occurred in 70 AD. Now, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around what this really meant, but this was the most significant Jewish historical event of the first century. Okay, this was the center of everything in the Jewish religion. Now, why is this important with what we're talking about? Well, the New Testament documents, they speak of Jerusalem and the temple and the activities associated with it as if they're still intact at the time. So what might that lead us to think?
It hasn't been destroyed yet.
It hadn't been destroyed yet, okay? So Jesus did predict the temple's destruction in a few passages up here. So why not include it if it had already happened? Because it would vindicate Jesus' prediction. It would seem to, like that he actually was right, okay? So to put it in perspective, imagine if you were reading a book on New York and the final pages were, hey, come to New York. The elevator hours for the World Trade Center are, what would you conclude, right? It happened before 9/11.
They wrote the book before 9/11.
Right. Right. Right, but that's kind of the line of reasoning that we're taking here, is that because none of the New Testament documents mention it, I mean, it's evidence that they were possibly written before 70 AD. But to put things into even more perspective, here's a quote from Frank Turek. He says, the Jews didn't lose just a couple of prominent buildings. They lost their entire country, their capital city, their temple, which had been the center of their religious, political, and economic life for the last 1,000 years. In addition, tens of thousands of their countrymen were dead from the Romans, and hundreds of their villages burned to the ground. Okay, so this is kind of the magnitude of what happened with the destruction of Jerusalem itself and the temple. Okay, so a better analogy, other than the World Trade Center, that I thought of would be something like this from Independence Day.
Oh.
Right, so imagine aliens came to Earth, destroyed the White House, Washington, D.C., and then you read a book on American history and it didn't mention this, right? But this is kind of the magnitude of in a way, it's almost a better analogy to what happened with the temple. Everything was destroyed, okay? All right, going back even further though, you can make an argument that the book of Acts was most likely written before 62 AD. How? Well, Acts does record the deaths of two Christian martyrs, Stephen and James, the brother of John. And it ends abruptly with Paul still living under house arrest, and it doesn't mention the deaths of Peter or James. This James is the brother of Jesus, and he was also the leader of the church in Jerusalem, okay? Now we know that Paul and Peter were both executed by 68 AD. But here's the thing, James, the brother of Jesus, he was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Now if he had been martyred, don't you think that that would have been in the book of Acts? Most likely, he was a pretty important guy. If they're mentioning Stephen and James, the brother of John, if the leader of the church in Jerusalem had been martyred, it seems like he would have been mentioned in Acts, right? But he's not. He's still living. And we know from Josephus that James, the brother of Jesus, was killed in 62 AD. So again, the line of reasoning here is that the book of Acts was most likely written before 62 AD. Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke, right. What else did Luke write? Which one did he write first?
Gospel.
Right, so we can deduce if Acts was written before 62 AD, Luke must have been written before Acts, right? He tells us. Acts 1, verses 1 through 2, Luke says, "In my first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to teach until the day when he was taken up, after he had chosen after he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. Okay, so this first book, it's obvious that he's talking about his own gospel. Okay, so again, Luke was written before that. Luke's gospel, in addition, quotes Mark and Matthew repeatedly, which means what? They must have been written before Luke, right? So going back to the timeline again. Here we have Acts. Luke was written before Acts, 60, 62 AD, some time frame in there. Matthew and Mark written before that. As Jay mentioned, Jesus was killed 30, 33 AD. So how many years are we far removed from Jesus' death and resurrection? Yeah, assuming 30, let's say it was 30 AD, we're talking 25 to 30 years, right? Now, you're like, well, why didn't they just write about it in the next day's newspaper, right? Well, here's the thing. To put things in perspective, everyone's heard of Alexander the Great. Well, Plutarch and Arrian wrote biographies of Alexander the Great 400 to 450 years after the events. Yet they are considered to be accurate and truthful. So the gap of only 3 decades or so for the Gospels is extraordinarily short by ancient documentary standards, especially compared to something like Alexander the Great. Craig Blomberg, New Testament scholar, he says, historically speaking, especially compared to Alexander the Great, that's like a newsflash. 25 to 30 years by ancient standards. Yes?
I think, isn't it believed that most of the apostles were actually very young at the time those events actually took place, so for them to wait 20 to 30 years, it still wouldn't be very old, so it's not like they've forgotten half of what happened by the time they write it down.
I don't know their ages, but yeah, it's not, I can't imagine they were that old. Yeah, I would agree. I don't really know their ages. Does anyone know their ages?
This was like 30 at the time he died, so we could probably assume they would have been around his age, maybe?
I think it,
Yeah, or maybe just possibly younger,
most
right?
of the apostles were like in their 20s except for Peter, and then
Yeah.
and aside from him, Jesus was the eldest.
Yeah, 20 years is not that long, 25, 30 years. If they were in their 20s or 30s, they would have still been around. Okay, so we've talked about the temple, 70 AD, book of Acts. We know that Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke before Acts, and he quotes from Mark and Matthew repeatedly, also before, or implying that they were written before Luke. But here's the thing. Some of the New Testament books were penned in the 40s and 50s with sources from the 30s, only a few years after Jesus' death. And one of the main sources that is pointed to is the passage in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. This is an early creed of the church. And by creed, we don't mean like the Apostles' Creed, the Athanasian Creed, not those types of creeds. We mean just short, memorable passages that someone could memorize before the New Testament was written. Okay? So let's look at the timeline again. Here's Paul. He writes 1 Corinthians 53 to 55 AD. Scholars will grant this. Again, that's only about 20 years or so after, 20 to 25 years after Jesus' death. But the information in this passage that we're going to look at dates back to the 30s. Now here's the passage. It's an early creed in 1 Corinthians 15. And you probably all have seen this. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at a time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. So that's the creed. And it's laid out. Dr. Gary Habermas has estimated there's probably about 41 or so creeds in the New Testament that can be referred to similarly as this creed. But this is probably the most famous. So let's look at a skeptical scholar. John Dominic Crossan, co-founder of the Jesus Seminar. How many of you have heard of the Jesus Seminar before? A few of you. A very skeptical group of New Testament scholars who basically look at the sayings of Jesus and try to whittle down whether or not he actually said the things that are claimed that he said, and they really whittle it down. I don't know if you know the percentage, but they basically say almost everything Jesus is claimed to have said, he didn't really say. Okay, so they're very skeptical. But so John Dominic Crossan is the co-founder, and this is what he says about this passage in 1 Corinthians. He says, Paul wrote to the Corinthians from Ephesus in the early 50s. But he says in 1 Corinthians 15 that I handed on to you as of first importance, which I in turn received. Crossan says here, the most likely source and time for his reception of that tradition would have been in Jerusalem in the early 30s. So here's a skeptical scholar who's saying that Paul received this information himself in the 30s, just a few years after Jesus' death. Okay? And they look to Galatians 1:18, where he went up to Jerusalem to visit Peter and stayed with him 15 days. Okay? So let's summarize this in pictorial form. So we talked about, we'll start backwards. Destruction of the temple in 70 AD. None of the New Testament documents mention it. We talked about the death of James in 62, not mentioned in Acts, implying that Acts was written before that. We know that Luke was written before Acts. Luke quotes Mark and Matthew. And Paul writes 1 Corinthians with material that goes back to the 30s. Okay, so what's the point of all of this? The point is that most, if not all, of the New Testament was written prior to 70 AD, and we have written Gospels that were being circulated within 25 to 30 years after the death of Jesus, extraordinary by ancient standards, and then the source material going back to the 30s. All of this is too early for any of the accounts to be legendary. It's just not enough time for a legend to have evolved in just such a short amount of time. It usually takes 2 or 3 generations, I think, before legends start to evolve and come to life. It's just not enough time for that to happen. That's the point of having early testimony. Eyewitness testimony. The next thing we want to look at. Why would it be good to have eyewitness testimony?
Get it straight from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, someone who was there and saw these things, we probably want to hear what they had to say. Well, do we have eyewitness testimony? Well, all of the New Testament books written in the first century were either written by eyewitnesses or close associates to those eyewitnesses. Okay, so we have Matthew and John. They were direct apostles. We have Mark. He was an associate of Peter, and Peter himself was a direct apostle. Luke was an associate of Paul, and he states how carefully he related eyewitness accounts. So Luke himself was not an eyewitness, but he interviewed eyewitnesses. Paul had a personal encounter with Jesus, and he was a contemporary of the apostles. James, we already talked about, he's the brother of Jesus. Jude, one of the other books in the Bible, also a brother of Jesus. The author of Hebrews, we don't know, but the author was a contemporary of the apostles. It's in Hebrews 13:23. But so we have eyewitness testimony. I'm not going to read all these, but I just highlighted the key words here. Witnesses. Seen, heard, saw, touched, looked, seen, heard. We were eyewitnesses. We are witnesses. Okay? Myths, they don't typically either try to state that they're literally telling the truth or even plausibly telling the truth. Yet we have many passages in Scripture where these guys are claiming, hey, we were there, we saw this, we were witnesses, we heard this, we touched him, here's some more. Lots of references to being witnesses. Okay? Now, let's go back to one of our objections. They were all biased. You can't trust anything they wrote down. Okay, maybe they were eyewitnesses, but they're biased. They exaggerated. They embellished. Well, let's look at the objection first. Okay, were the New Testament writers devoted followers of Jesus, fully committed to him and his teachings? Yes. Does it therefore follow, logically, that they were incapable of telling the truth or being objective? Does it follow just because they were eyewitnesses and they were his followers that they can't tell the truth? That doesn't follow, right? You'd have to make a good case to explain why that follows necessarily just from this fact. It doesn't follow. So this objection basically is committing what's called a genetic fallacy, discounting a claim because of some perceived fault in its origin. Okay, consider this. If an American wrote a history of the United States, would that history necessarily be unreliable or distorted? Or more poignantly, some of the most important accounts of the Nazi Holocaust have been composed by Jews. Does that fact render them inaccurate? On the contrary, those passionately interested in the events are often the most meticulous in recording them. To claim that the Gospels cannot be historical because they were written by believers is fallacious. Consider this further. The whole life of Jesus was based on integrity, character, faithfulness, truthfulness, sacrifice. This is what the disciples learned. This is what they were being taught. So, were the disciples biased? Yes. But to what? To lying? To exaggerating? Or were they biased to tell the truth? Consider that. Okay, they were biased, but they're biased to tell the truth. Maybe they took the time to carefully write these things down because they wanted to make sure that they were not misunderstood. Okay? And think about this. Do people invent stories that'll get them beaten, tortured, or killed? Doesn't make sense, right? Devin, should we end or should we keep going?
I mean, if people need to leave, they can go ahead and leave, and if they want to stay and hear the rest, they can stay. Hear the rest.
Okay. Yeah, you will not offend me if you have to leave. You've got somewhere to go. I promise. All right, does everyone understand the bias objection and how it's not really a strong objection? Especially when you compare it to something like Holocaust survivors, right? I mean, are we going to say just because they were Holocaust survivors that they cannot be trusted? Thanks for coming. Okay, the next on our list here, embarrassing testimony. We've talked about this frequently at Ratio Christi, but let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever lied to make yourself look good or to get out of trouble? Yep. And if your hand's not raised now, you're lying to make yourself look good. Right. Right, we've all done it. But how many of you have ever lied to make yourself look bad or to get into trouble? Anyone ever lied to get into trouble? To make yourself look dumb, stupid, bad? Probably not, okay? It's not really human nature to do that. So when we talk about this embarrassing testimony, we're talking about something called the criterion of embarrassment. What it is if a statement of historical fact is embarrassing to the author or the movement that he's writing about, it's probably true. Why? Because it would reflect honest reporting rather than creative storytelling. Okay? Why would you invent details that would be embarrassing, that would paint you in a bad light, that might make you lose credibility? Why would you do that unless it were true? If you were just trying to to write down an accurate account of things. The New Testament includes embarrassing details about both the disciples and Jesus. Okay? Let's look at some of these. So with the disciples, they're painted as being dim-witted. Numerous times they fail to understand what Jesus is saying. They're painted as being uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus twice after he asked them to stay up and pray with him during his greatest hour of need. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial, but the Gospels record that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the very court that sentenced him to die. They're rebuked. Peter is called Satan by Jesus. After Peter tried to rebuke Satan in the first place, Jesus in the first place, Jesus calls him Satan. And then later, the Gospels record Paul rebukes Peter on a theological issue. Okay? They're painted as being cowards. Peter denies Christ 3 times. All but one of the disciples hides when Jesus goes to the cross. 2 days later, while the men are still hiding for fear, the women, the brave women, are the ones that go down and discover the empty tomb. Okay, why would you put these things in there if they weren't true? It's not really painting you in the best light here. The disciples are portrayed as doubters. They're doubtful at first when they hear about the resurrection. And even after they see Jesus, some are still doubtful. Let's go back to the empty tomb and the women discovering the empty tomb. All 4 Gospels mention this. Now, women were not even considered credible witnesses in first century Palestine. So why would you record this in the Gospels unless it really happened? Wouldn't it be better to say that the men were the ones who went down to the tomb? Wouldn't they have more credibility in that sense? Okay. The Gospel writers had every reason to ignore this fact that the women found the empty tomb because it would have been more easily accepted by others. So this embarrassing fact shows the unlikelihood that the empty tomb narratives were being fabricated. Does that make sense? Everyone kind of get that sense of embarrassment, the criterion of embarrassment? Okay. What about Jesus? There are some things about him that are written that could be considered embarrassing. Okay, he's considered out of his mind. In Mark 3:21 and 31, he's deserted by many of his followers. He's not believed by his own brother. James, by the way, the one we talked about that was martyred in 62, who became the leader of the church in Jerusalem, he was not a believer in Jesus while Jesus was alive. He was a skeptic. He later came to believe in him once he saw the resurrected Jesus. Anyway, he's not believed. He's thought to be a deceiver, a madman, a drunkard, demon-possessed. Jesus had his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which could easily have been seen as a sexual advance in Luke 7:36-39. Why would you put these things in there? It's not painting Jesus in a good light in that sense, okay? Last, Jesus was crucified despite the fact that anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse. There's more. These are just a flavor. Okay, so Frank Turek has written a short little story that says if men were inventing the resurrection, it would sound more like this. He's already laughing. Jesus came to save the world, and he needed our help. That's why we were there for him every step of the way. When he was in need, we prayed with him. When he wept, we wept with him and told him to toughen up. When he fell, we carried his cross. The gates of hell could not prevent us from seeing his mission through. So when that turncoat Judas brought the Romans by, we always suspected Judas, and they began to nail Jesus to the cross, we laughed at them. He's God, you idiots. The grave will never keep him. You think you're solving a problem, but you're really creating a much bigger one. While we assured the women that everything would turn out all right, they couldn't handle the crucifixion. Squeamish and afraid, they ran to their homes, screaming and hid behind locked doors. But we men stood steadfast at the foot of the cross, praying for hours until the very end when Jesus finally took his last breath. And the Roman centurion confessed that Jesus was God. Peter blasted him. That's what we told you before you nailed him up there. Through this whole thing, the Romans and the Jews just wouldn't listen. Never doubting that Jesus would rise on the third day, Peter announced to the centurion, "We'll bury him and be back on Sunday. Now go and tell Pilate to put some of your elite Roman guards at the tomb to see if you can prevent him from rising from the dead." We all laughed and began to dream about Sunday. That Sunday morning, we marched right down to the tomb and tossed those elite Roman guards aside. Then the stone that took 11 of us to roll into place rolled away by itself. A glowing Jesus emerged from the tomb and said, "I knew you'd come. My mission is accomplished. He praised Peter for his brave leadership and congratulated us on our great faith. Then we went home and comforted the trembling women. It's absurd, right? But the point is, this is a much more heroic portrayal of the disciples versus them cowering and hiding and being afraid, right? So that's the idea behind the criterion of embarrassment. Excruciating testimony. What we're talking about here is the willingness of the apostles to suffer persecution, torture, and death for their belief that they had seen the risen Jesus. The strength of their conviction, their willingness to die, indicates that they did not fabricate their claims. Okay, so again, think about this. Do people invent stories that will get them beaten, tortured, and killed? Do people willingly suffer persecution, torture, and death because of their lies when they could save themselves by simply admitting that they're not true? Yes?
I saw something that related actually Watergate to this, where I forget who it was.
It's Chuck Colson.
Yeah. He said in Watergate, 12 of the world's most powerful men were like grilled, and they couldn't hold up their lies for 3 weeks. And so it's ridiculous to think that instead 12 random disciples were able to hold on to that lie under Roman persecution for 40 years.
Right.
I saw that actually. I don't know if you can share it.
It was a meme that was making the rounds on Facebook.
I saw
I
saw something.
But here's an objection. What about others that have willingly died for their faith? Do the radical Muslims involved in the 9/11 attacks prove the truth of Islam? They died for their faith. Apostles died for their faith. Same thing, right? Well, actually not. Why? This objection misses a key difference between the deaths of the apostles and modern martyrs. Okay? Modern martyrs die for what they sincerely believe is true, but their knowledge comes secondhand from others. What's the difference with the apostles? Say again?
There's this firsthand, they saw it.
They were there. Right. So the beliefs of the apostles were not received secondhand, but from personal experience. Okay? They were eyewitnesses. That's the difference. They proclaimed what they had seen and heard with their own eyes and ears, not stories they received from others. Yes, modern martyrs are sincere, but there's a distinction between secondhand and firsthand martyrs here. Okay? Sean McDowell, who's written this book, it just came out last year, I think, called The Fate of the Apostles, where he tracks all of the, basically the deaths of the apostles. And there's better evidence for some than others, but the point is, he says, near the end of his book, he says, if the resurrection did not happen, the apostles would have willingly suffered and died for something they knew was false. They would have known it. Not just that they're sincere about it, they would have known. So while people die for what they believe is true, it's a stretch to think that all of the apostles were willing to suffer and die for a claim that they knew was false. That's the difference. Okay? And he also goes on to say that well, don't worry about that. It's not important. Does everyone understand this, though? The difference between a modern martyr and what happened with the apostles? Okay, they refused to deny that they had seen the risen Jesus because they were there. So the conclusion, they knew whether it was a lie or a hoax, the resurrection. What accounts for their transformation from scared followers into bold proclaimers of the faith? They probably saw the risen Jesus. People may willingly die for something they believe to be the truth, but no one willingly dies for a lie that they know is a lie, unless there's something not right. It's just not human nature. All right, last of all, thanks for being patient. Let's look at some extra biblical testimony here. Question?
No.
Okay. So are there writings outside of the New Testament that support the accounts of Jesus and Christianity? Well, in fact, there are, okay? At least 10 known non-Christian writers mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. Just to give you some perspective, over that same time period, only 9 non-Christian sources mention Tiberius Caesar, who was the emperor when Jesus was crucified. So we have 10 mentioning Jesus, only 9 mentioning Tiberius Caesar. Just to give you some perspective here. This is from Frank Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So just using extra biblical testimony from some ancient historians, Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, who else do I have up there? Yeah, Pliny the Younger. And that's not all of them, I just did that for a graphic. But basically, you can look at some of these facts here that can be established from things outside of the Bible. Okay, Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar, lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker, brother of James, acclaimed to be the Messiah, crucified under Pontius Pilate, crucified on the eve of the Passover. Darkness and an earthquake occurred when he died. The disciples believe he rose from the dead. They were willing to die for that belief. Christianity spread rapidly, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. I didn't put all of them up here, but I just want to go over a couple. So here's a passage from Josephus. Is this the... Yeah, this is the... There is a disputed passage in Josephus's work, which seems to have been tampered with, embellished by later Christians, but historians have been able to kind of reconstruct what an accepted rendering is. It's not like Josephus didn't write anything. He did. So this is kind of the uncorrupted version. It was later embellished. But Josephus, this is an accepted reading. He says, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man. He was one who wrought surprising feats, was a teacher of such people as accept truth gladly. He won over many Jews, many of the Greeks. I don't want to read all this, but Pilate, it talks about Pilate, the fact that he was crucified, and that the Christians are still, to this day, they still have not disappeared. And this was written in 93. So about 60 years later, Christians are still around. But it talks about some of these facts that we just mentioned a minute ago. Here's another passage from Josephus where he talks about James, the brother of Jesus, and how he was killed. He was stoned to death. Tacitus mentions some of the persecution of early Christians. Again, mentions Pilate. Pliny the Younger. This is important. It talks about they sang an alternate verses, a hymn to Christ as to a God. They're worshiping Jesus as a God. This is outside of the Bible. Marabar Serapion also talks about Jesus and his teachings living on well after the death of Jesus. And Lucian, who was a 2nd century satirist, he also talks about how Christians worship a man to this day who was crucified, and that Christians deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage, meaning Jesus. Okay, so these are not all of them, but these are just some of the extra biblical passages. What's the point? Okay, the point is that it disproves the absurd contention that you may still hear, you may have heard, that Jesus never lived. Anyone heard that? Jesus never lived, just a myth? Okay. It's hard to take that kind of a claim serious when there is such extra biblical testimony out there, okay, that shows.
Yeah, that's not taken seriously among New Testament scholars.
Right, but it's kind of like the popular level. That's what I want to kind of equip you with, is just when you hear some of this stuff, okay? So again, here's Bart Ehrman. We've already talked about him a couple of times. He says, the reality is that every single author who mentions Jesus, pagan, Christian, or Jewish, was fully convinced that he at least lived. Even the enemies of Jesus, of the Jesus movement, thought so. Among their many slurs against the religion, his non-existence is never one of them. Jesus certainly existed. And Bart Ehrman has taken, again, Bart Ehrman, no friend to Christianity, but he has taken these Jesus mythers to task because Ehrman, if nothing else, is a top-rate historian, New Testament scholar. So that's why I put this quote in here. It's absurd to say that Jesus never existed. All right, I don't want to do a review unless you guys want to. Accurate? What's the next one?
True.
3 questions for accuracy. Yes, how many? How? Early. How important are the? Very good. And then for the documents for telling the truth, we just talked about those 5 E's. Can you remember any of them? Early, 1. Extra biblical. Embarrassing. Excruciating. Eyewitness, yes. Whoop. Yeah. And of course, we talked in a lot more detail with that. We're short on time. We'll wrap it up.
Mike, quick
yes.
question. If they want this PowerPoint from you, are you willing to email them?
Sure. Just come up and give me your email.
Let us get, Philip, you got a sheet? Philip, you got a sheet? Then we can get emails. And good job, Mike.